Okay, we are recording. This is our. It's going to say 19th, but it's really the 21st because Michael and I did an intro and Michael did a week. So it's really our 21st, but I'm not counting those two, or I didn't start out counting those two. Let me put it that way. So I want to read a couple of comments from a couple of commentaries about this chapter before we get into it. One of them is the ESV Study Bible. That's not, well, actually, neither one of these are commentaries, but I'm going to read a comment from the ESV Study Bible and to read a comment from Hallie's Bible Handbook about today's study, about chapter 6. I copied them because they kind of explain a little bit about what the author of Second Kings is writing about in chapter 6. Well, he or she actually is talking about what happens in chapter 6, 7, and 8. But we're only going to do chapter 6 today. And here's what Hallie's Bible Handbook said. Elisha had begun his ministry with miracles, as told in chapter 2. Miracle upon miracle follows. A widow's oil supplies increased. The Shunammite's son is raised from the dead. A poisonous stew is made edible. And we've gone through all of these. Loaves of bread are multiplied. Naaman's leprosy is healed. An axe head is made to float. That's today. The Syrians are routed by horses and chariots of God. That's today. And nearly all that is recorded of Elisha is about his miracles. I mean, that's basically what we read about when we in these chapters, and we're reading about Elisha. Most of his miracles were acts of kindness and mercy, as we've seen, and we will continue to see. Now, here's what the ESV Study Bible says. With the healing of Naaman, and you remember that Naaman was the Syrian that had leprosy. With the healing of Naaman, Elisha has involved himself with Syria for the first time. That involvement now occupies most of the attention of the authors for the next two chapters. And listen to this. As they prepare for the bloody events of chapters 8 through 10, which we will get to in a few weeks. So anyway, that's what those two books said about chapter 6. So in verses 1 through 7, we learn about the floating axe head. Elisha lived among and worked with the sons of the prophets. We did a study on them last week. The communities of the prophets were fairly mobile. They could move around. They didn't have to be in one place. They could relocate whenever their homes or a neighborhood began to be overcrowded. To find room in today's lesson, they went to the lower Jordan River Valley, to one of the many places where the well-watered lower floodplain abounded with trees and thickets and other vegetation. Okay, so here's what verse 1 says. Now the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, behold now the place, hey, look, Elisha, the house is too small. Our barracks is too small. We're going to have to find something larger. And what we want to do is we want to go down to the Jordan River where there's a lot of trees, and it says, and take there a beam. Obviously they took more than a beam, but anyway, and he said, let us make a place there for ourselves where we may live. So apparently they're going to go down and they're going to cut down some trees. They're going to get, make lumber, and they're going to build a place to live, apparently down close to the Jordan. Now, Elisha authorizes the sons of the prophet to go, as it says in verse 2. Please let us go to the Jordan. And he says at the end, he says, go. but they ask him to accompany them, and he agrees. And they said, "Please be willing to go with your servants." And he answered, "Okay, I'll go with you." So he went, and they went to the Jordan, and they cut down trees. But as one was felling a beam, the axe head fell into the water. And he cried out. He was very upset. And he said, "Alas, my master, for it was borrowed." Well, it was just an axe head. Why was the man so upset? Just go get another one. Well, he was upset because iron was very expensive. It'd been about 200 years since the Israelites had gotten the how to make iron from the Philistines. So because it was borrowed, the loss was even more acute. This guy was really upset about it. And iron tools were very expensive. Now, we always run across, we quite occasionally run across we don't know questions. And we're going to, we've got a few right here. They're not any big deal, but they are questions where we really don't know why. And in this case, none of these questions seem to be important, but they are requirements of Elisha. So Elisha asked the guy, he said, "Well, where did it go in the water?" And when he showed him the place, he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. And then he told the guy, "Take it up for yourselves. Go in there, pick it up, get it out of the water." So he put out his hand and he took it. Well, often when we see a prophet about to perform a miracle, of course, God's performing the miracle, but you understand what I mean. They ask somebody to do something, and we look back and we go, "Well, why did he have him do that?" And we've got some of those here. Why did Elisha need to know where it fell? Elisha, if God had given him the ability to raise it up out of the water, he surely could have figured out where it was. But no, he asked the man, where did it go in the water? And then he told him to go cut a stick and throw it in the water. Why did he need a stick thrown in the water? Why didn't he just say, "Hey, iron, float"? And why did the man who lost the axe handle need to, in verse 7, take it up for yourself? So he put his hand out and took it. These are not important questions, but they're we don't know questions. We don't know why Elisha asked where it fell. I don't see that was necessary, but these are things that Elisha wanted the man to do, and it may be that God wanted the man to do it. But anyway, it's like I say, it's not that big a deal. Okay, so now beginning in verse 8.
Wait.
Yeah, Michael.
Are you gonna wax a little bit more eloquent on miracles as far as the biblical application of the person receiving the miracle has to do something, or are you done with that thought? I don't want to step.
I'm handing that thought over to you.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna note that even when you look at the miracles of Jesus, the healings that were done, something had to be done, mostly by the person that needed to be healing. I mean, the man that was paralyzed, he had to get up. First, he was asked, "Do you want to be healed?" Because again, there's a lot of people that enjoy their victimhood. They don't want to get out of being in a crippled state or a place of sickness. And so, Jesus asked the man, "Do you want to be healed?" And he tells him, "You have to get up and grab your bed and walk." I mean, there's something that has to be done. So I just find it very interesting that miracles aren't just done completely for us without any effort on anyone's behalf other than God performing it. And I thought you were going to wax on a little bit about that. Well, Mark is, that's good.
What about Peter and John walking to the temple, and the beggar was begging money, and Peter didn't ask him anything, he just did it? Isn't that the way it happened?
Oh, it did. I was just noting the parts where there was something required of the person that had something done. I'm not saying all miracles were that way.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I mean, there's miracles where people were healed because of their shadows,
Right.
laying on them. So yeah, there's that too. I just find it very interesting that on a lot of occasions also there's something required, as Skip pointed out, that you guys had to do something. You know, stick your hand in the water, grab the stick, and whatnot. I just thought that was an interesting dichotomy. That might be an interesting discussion to have in the future on miracles and what types, and why did God require things to be done in order for the miracles, to happen, like when Jesus put the spit and clay on the man's eyes and told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam before his eyesight returned. That might be an interesting study at some point in the future, Skip.
Yeah, and I think you're making a good point that we need to show our faith. When Jesus, or when a prophet tells us to do something that doesn't make any sense, you do it because you have faith that that you're going to get healed. Now, I want to throw this out. I heard this in a movie the other night. It's a Christian movie. It's the acting is not good, but there's two Christian movies that I bet you I've watched them 100 times. Diane will tell you that in the last 3 or 4 weeks, because there's some things in it that really get me going. And it's about a coach who she's never coached a cross country team before, but she's always, she didn't just quote scripture, she uses them as analogies or metaphors for her girls that are running. And one thing she said, and I have not checked it out yet, so you all please check it out, see what you can find out. But she was talking about the blind man, I think Bartimaeus or something like that was his name. And Jesus, asked him what he wanted, or asked him if he could be, I can't remember exactly. And it says that, or according to the girl, and I haven't checked this out, she said that he took off his robe, Bartimaeus, and threw it off. Now, this coach went on to say blind people back then wore a particular color or type of garment that let people know they were blind. I don't know if that's true or not, but it made it interesting. And her point was that he took his coat off that showed he was blind and threw it or dropped it. And Jesus said, "Your faith has made you whole." So anyway, that's enough on that. But if anybody knows about that or has done any research, I thought that was one. If what she's saying was accurate, I thought it was very interesting. So anyway, I need to go check that out.
Well, just as an extension of this little bit of a discussion, which I'd be interesting to have a study on it later. When you think about the biggest miracle of all, which is that of salvation, it was performed and given to everybody. That Jesus, before the world war, Jesus died for everybody's sins, and yet those of us he calls along the way, he asks us to repent and be baptized. So there's that element of you being asked to do something when you recognize that the miracle is there for you. But there's that huge component of people for whom the miracle is also there that don't recognize it, and so far have not been asked to do anything about it. It's just an interesting thing that until you're at the right place in life, it seems like, and the recognition is there, then nothing is asked of you in order to receive the miracle.
Yeah.
And springing off of that, Susan here, and following what Mark had said, when I'm thinking about Peter and John on the way to the temple, the man looked at them expecting to receive something. Peter answered and said, "Hey, listen, we haven't got money, but what we have, we'll give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up, walk." So there was the expectation and there was the action. I wonder what would have happened if he hadn't tried to stand up. So that kind of springs into what both Mark and Joe were saying.
Yeah, I don't think anything would have happened. I think that was his show of faith. So yeah, let's do one on this later on.
I was sort of interested in the axe head coming off. There's two mentions of that in the Bible. The first one somewhere in the Torah, and if the axe head comes off and kills somebody, I think it says you can go to a city of refuge because it's still manslaughter. It's not just it's the way they looked at it. But having had a few loose axe heads, one of the things you can do to sort of tighten it up is to soak it in water so that it swells the wood and it makes it tighter. Sometimes I guess. So maybe the fact that they were doing it by a river, maybe they had stuck it in the water and tried to tighten it up.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, here's a point. So I was curious about axe head. So so I looked up just to see what the word is, and of course there is translation that is fair enough. So the word is, so the axe head is not, how should I say this? There's only a singular word and it only means iron. So the interpreters interpreted it iron. So we don't know, we shouldn't necessarily think about it as being an axe like we're used to thinking about an axe. I don't know what to think about it other than that,
Well, to me, it's fairly logical on the, because just as was mentioned, an axe head can fly off. I mean, my dad worked for the Forest Service, and they were given these kind of cartoon OSHA-style books or whatever for the dangers of things that can happen because they swung axes all day, chopping trees and branches, and having the whole axe fly out of your hand if your hand was wet was one of them, and the axe head coming off was another one. And my dad used to routinely soak his axe on the handle in the tub of water to swell the wood to make sure that it tightened up. But the axe head coming off, that to me that is a fairly logical thing. When you read this, you can imagine that happening. He goes to swing the axe and the head's a little loose and it comes off and goes in the river. So I don't see that as an odd thing. And they've dug up pieces of iron and whatever they made, tools that they made way back that didn't take them long to work out the angle and the shape and whatever that worked for what they were doing. And if they were chopping wood to build buildings, it would make sense that they had something relatively similar to what we use today.
Yeah, I've had axe heads come off before, and fortunately in this case, no one was hurt. Of course, I do believe God sets things up sometimes, and if God set this up because He wanted to show these sons of the prophets, and there may have been other people around, let them see this miracle. So anyway, okay. Anything else on this? Because we're about to get into some really different stuff. Okay, beginning in verse 8, we have a totally unrelated event. You remember when I first read it, that the commentary, that it said that the authors of First and Second Kings wanted to show Elisha's miracles, and that's what's happening in this chapter. So this is a totally unrelated event to the floating axe head. It's and I think there's a little humor in it. I don't know if God intended the humor, but I found the humor, because the king of Syria believes he has a spy in his leadership. When I get into the reading of the verses here in a minute, you'll see that, because Elisha knows his every move. And, Elisha counteracts the king of Syria's moves on behalf of the king of Israel, which is another thing that's interesting, because the king of Israel hated Elisha and certainly didn't worship the same God that Elisha worshipped. And it's like, as we go through all of this, it's like, and I hate to say this, but it's like some of us today. When we need God, we go to him and we pray and so on, and then things get better. And when I say we, I'm not talking about this group. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so here we have the king of Israel who hates Elisha's guts, but is taking advantage of what Elisha is doing. So this next section is about the kingdom of Aram. And if you remember, Aram is Syria, or a big part of Syria. And so beginning here, I'm going to use the New King James Version because it calls the nation Syria rather than Aram. Now, you would think that Israel and its kings are far past receiving help from God, but God hadn't given up on them yet. It's like he's given them one more chance. This episode that we're about to go through, it's like he's given them one more chance to know him and to worship him. So Elisha tells the king of Israel's what, the plans of Syria. And the king of Israel takes advantage of that knowledge, and he knows full well where it comes from. But again, we can't be sure who this king is, but several of the commentaries believe that it was King Joram. But there was also King Ahijah that it could have been. So it doesn't really make any difference. It's the king of Israel. So the Syrians plan to lay a trap for the Israelites. But Elisha tells the king of Israel about it. And the king of Israel doubled the size of his troops. And this infuriated the king of Syria. And we see this beginning in verse 8. Now the king of Syria was making war against Israel, and he consulted with his servants, saying, okay, look, here's the plan. We're gonna lay a trap for part of the soldiers of Israel. Well, God gives this information to Elisha, and Elisha warns the king of Israel about the trap. And the king didn't ignore him. He didn't say, oh, your God's worthless. He doesn't, you need to pray to our God. No. And it shows that God has not yet given up on Israel. And the thing that gets me is that the kings of Israel and Judah are shown these great miracles, yet, particularly in the northern tribes, they forget Yahweh as soon as the miracle is passed. And like I said, I'm afraid that many Christians today are kind of the same way. So keep that in mind as we go through this study. So verse 9, this man of God is Elisha, of course, and so he told the king of Israel, don't take your soldiers past this place. It's a trap. And the king of Israel sent to the place about which the man of God had told him, and he guarded himself there more than once or twice. In other words, because Elisha had told the king, and I'm going to say Joram, but it may not have been Joram, but he had told Joram, hey, Syria's laid a trap. You send your regular sized troops down there, they're going to get slaughtered. So he doubled them, maybe tripled the size of the army that he's sending down there. And the king of Syria is convinced that there's a spy. And you want to know who the spy was? It says that, the heart of the king of Syria was greatly troubled. He was angry. And he called his servants and said, okay, guys, which one of you is the spy? I know there's a spy in here. Who is it? Who's telling Israel what we're doing? And one of his servants said, no, my lord, O king, it's Elisha. He's the prophet in Israel, and he's telling the king of Israel what you speak in your bedroom, in your secret meetings and so on. God is telling Elisha what's going on. Elisha then goes and tells the king of Israel. And so the king of Syria sits back and goes, we need this guy. He's really hurting our forces here. And so let's go capture him. Right here in verse 13. So he said, go and see where he is, that I may send and take him. And it was told him, saying, behold, he's in Dothan. Now there's at least two reasons why the king of Syria would want Elisha. One, to get him to tell the king of Syria what Israel's going to do. Two, to get him, to keep him from telling to Israel what his plans are. Two, to get him to come over to the side of Syria. Or three, just to take him out of the way, where he's not involved at all. At any rate, whatever the reason, he wants Elisha captured. And this Dothan caught my attention. Here's a map of where Dothan is, and you can see that it's right there in Samaria, very close to the city of Samaria. Although the city of Samaria is not there, unless that Samaria in green is actually the city. But since there's no dot, I'm not sure that it's not talking about the quote country. Well, Dothan's only about 10 miles north of the capital city of Samaria. And this shows how far Syria had penetrated into Israel at this time. But the king of Syria is deluded in his belief that he can send and seize Elisha. Yeah, good luck, king of Syria, whatever your name is. Well, Ben-Hadad is his name, actually. And by the way, Dothan is the site where Joseph was sold to the traders who carried him into Egypt. Genesis, there it is, 37:17. The man said, they're departed from here. And I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. And then that's where he gets sold off. Okay, so the king of Syria sent a large force to Dothan at night to capture Elisha. One man, large force. But they had a surprise waiting for him. Says he sent horses and chariots and a great army there just to capture this one guy. And they came by night and they surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God arose, all right. Now remember Gehazi? He was the servant of Elisha who tried to trick the Naaman into giving him, some silver and clothes and so on. So I don't think this is Gehazi. I think Gehazi's been long gone and fired with the gift of leprosy to go along with him through his family. So when the servant of Elisha arose early and went out, guess what he saw? An army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant was scared to death. What are we going to do? Now, verse 16 that I'm about to show is a verse that I'm sure many of us already have burned in our minds, but we need to burn it in our minds. We need to always be aware of this. Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. That's always true. We have, we may not have an army of spiritual beings around us, but they're with us. We have guardian angel. And so in verse 17, Elisha prayed. Elisha could see the spiritual army that was there waiting to fight for him if necessary. Elisha prayed and said, Yahweh, I pray, open my servant's eyes that he may see. Then Yahweh opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Now, there are other times that this has happened. So instead of, but here's where the kindness of Elisha shows, because guess what? The king of Israel wants them dead. He wants, let's go attack, let's kill every one of them. But instead of allowing the Israelites to kill the Syrians, God struck them with blindness. When the Syrians came down to him, Elisha prayed to Yahweh and said, strike this people, I pray, with blindness. He didn't say strike them dead, strike them with blindness. So he struck them with blindness, and Elisha went to the leader of the troops, who was blind, couldn't see a thing, and he said, you guys have come the wrong way. This isn't the city. Follow me. I'll bring you to the man whom you seek. In other words, I'll take you to me. But he led him to Samaria. So it was when they had come to Samaria that Elisha said, Yahweh, please open the eyes of these men that they may see what a predicament they're in. And Yahweh opened their eyes. And they saw, and there they were, inside Samaria, surrounded. And the king of Samaria, whether that's, anyway, doesn't matter who it was, he's thinking, aha, I can rid myself of these Syrians for good. But God and Elisha had other plans. So they gave them a feast. They're prisoners. When the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, and he called him my father, by the way, which is also kind of interesting, because there were times, as I said earlier, when the king of Israel would take advantage. And so he's schmoozing up Elisha. Shall I kill him? Shall I kill him? I wonder what the king of Israel wanted to do here. Shall I kill him? Shall I kill them? And Elisha answered and said, no, you're not only are you not going to kill them, but you're going to give them food and water and give them a banquet that they may eat and drink and go to their master, and tell the king of Syria, they had us trapped. They could have killed every one of us, but they sent us home after they fed us. And so it says these, okay, here's where he prepared a great feast, and after they ate and drank, he sent them away. And it says, so the bands of Syrian raiders came no more into the land of Israel. Now, we know that Syria did come back into the land of Israel. So there's a couple of ways to look at this. Number one, Syria didn't come back Syria didn't raid Israel for many, many, many years. But these bands, these little, skirmish groups, 50 of them would go in and hit Israel and then leave. But this time they were blinded and so on. This didn't end the wars with Syria, but it put them off for a long time. Now, history gets a little confusing at this point. We may have an advantage because we're not told who the king of Israel is, because we are told who the king of Syria is, and his name's Ben-Hadad. There were four.
Skip, can we go back
Sure.
Verses to verse 15? And I'd like to pose, this is about the armies that were surrounding the city where Elisha and Gehazi, or his servant, are. And he said this very inspiring thing, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And he asked for his eyes to be opened. So he opened the eyes of the young man, and the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around. So I'd like to pose the question, where were they before?
I think they were there. I just don't think anybody could see them.
Okay, I think that's a good answer. I don't think that they all of a sudden came there from somewhere else. It seems that they were already there. I think that this is the point. The points I guess I'm getting to is that in these sections of Kings, we've seen these, what we see as miracles, and it seems, and I've mentioned this before, it seems that the people at that time this was part of their life. I mean, this is usual. It seems to be usual fare. It was something that was much more part of their life in their realization. But the point I'm also making is that where did these beings, these horses and chariots of fire, and we suppose that there were somebody in the chariot, where were they before? Well, we know that God dwells in heaven. We know that the heavens are full of the host, which is the armies of heaven. And I guess the point I'm getting to is that they're right there. Now, the instant before, nobody could see. Gehazi couldn't see. Elisha either could see or he knew. And what is it any different with us? In other words, there's a world there that we just don't see, but they're there. And so this is, from our perspective, in a sense, how close God is to us, how close his armies are to us, how close the enemies are to us, the powers. They're there, we just don't see them. And so heaven is right there, isn't it? Where am I wrong? How am I wrong?
No, I think you're exactly right. Particularly with Israel and Judah, I think these forces were always there. Now we do have a couple other places, don't we, where this happens, and God opened the minds of the enemy, and they fled because they saw him.
Right.
So I think you're exactly right, Mark. I think they're here. I tell you what, and I know all of you have too. I've had situations where I should be dead. Driving down the road, went to sleep. Diane will vouch for that. And all of a sudden, I woke up just in time to dodge the pole or the tree or the ditch. And I know you all have all done the same things. It's a smaller scale, but I think you're exactly right. I think, the spiritual realm, which you covered really, really well a couple of months ago, is always there. We just can't see them.
Yeah, and it's a reality. This is a little picture of really, it's no different for us. And that's how far help is from us. It's there. That's how far contact is. It's right there. The only time where we have something said is what's there in Daniel chapter 9 or 10, where that angel, that messenger said, I've been fighting with the prince of Greece, and Michael came to help me. I had we wanted to come 3 weeks ago, and there's been resistance. So we should keep these things in mind, I think.
Yeah, we should, but we should also have a balance. I'm trying to put some balance here. You remember when the Apostle Stephen was martyred? Jesus Christ was there in his vision, standing. He wasn't sitting at the right hand; he was standing. But even though he was able to see that God was with him, sometimes Yahweh Elohim, for his glory, his purpose, we don't always get saved out of whatever calamities the puppets of the adversary are going to try and do to us. Again, it all works together for good. The only reason I bring this up again is because the prosperity gospel that we've all been immersed in our culture sometimes skews a lot of people's views, and that, well, God's always going to save me out of any trouble that I ever come in. And then if it doesn't happen the way they expect, their faith is shaken. I've seen that a couple of times, and I think as things get tough, it's easy then for people to throw up their hands and quit and give up. And so I guess I have a kind of a raw nerve to that, and I think it's basically because of what I saw happens to our brethren in India, and I don't even measure up to them. And they endure persecution on a level that you can't even wrap your minds around, and still my faith was shaken. Theirs wasn't, because that's every day for them. So I've been tempered in my thoughts because of my experience, that sometimes God allows us to go through, bad things. Even though there are armies of the Most High, they're there just as much as there are demons of the adversary surrounding us also. So being mindful of the spiritual war we're in is very good to be mindful of. I'm sorry, Mark.
Your point's excellent, Michael, and I wasn't trying to imply that we always receive the answer that we want.
Right. No, I knew you weren't. I guess I was just trying to give a a balance to the point, because there's so many people I talk to that have been weaned on the the health, wealth, prosperity gospel, that the armies of the Lord are always there and he's always going to save me. And that's, we've read enough in scripture about persecution, and I've seen our faithful brethren go through things where it seems like, where are you, God, for our saints that serve you more faithfully than I have? And we just have to remember Romans 8:28, always keep that in the back of your minds with whatever we go through in life.
It was more illustrative of well, at least my perspective is that heaven's someplace far off. Heaven, where God is someplace far off. And we tend to think of distance as a restriction. And it was just to illustrate that, that distance is no object. Now, there may be other objects, as you mentioned, but distance is no object.
Yeah, that's a great point, because, and that's very true. That's something that's hard for us to wrap our heads around also, that the spiritual realm it's just something we can't see. It exists outside of our dimension, but you're right, it doesn't involve distance. God is always near and present if we would seek him, because that's what the scripture tells us. And that's a great point. Our God's not so far away that he can't save us, because it's not an issue of distance. So that's a good point to bring up, Mark. Thanks.
Yeah. Rod posted in the chat, how did Elisha get intelligence from the king's house? Prophets haven't previously demonstrated such abilities, have they? I can't think of a specific time, Rod, but God has opened the minds of prophets and people many times so that they know what's going on. So I think, yes, this has happened before, maybe not specifically the way, but that's just my opinion. But I don't think this is an anomaly. I think it's happened many times throughout, particularly with Israel and Judah when they were good, when they were obeying God. So okay, so we do have this army from God, this spiritual realm that is ready to help us at any time, unless it goes against God's plan or whatever. But I know this has happened. What we're reading right here has happened 2 or 3 other times in the scriptures. So okay. All right. So this didn't. Okay, I went back, didn't I? Let me get back to where I was. Were you all through, by the way, Michael and Mark?
Yeah, I just was piggybacking on Mark's comment.
Okay. All right, so this didn't end the war. It says, so the bands of Syrian raiders came no more into the land of Israel. Well, they didn't for many, many years. There was a lull. And there were several kings named Ben-Hadad, and Ben-Hadad is also the name of the Mesopotamian storm god. Okay, so how would you like to have been named after a pagan god? No, thank you. Or Jezebel, or anyway. Okay, so there's this lull in the war between Israel and Syria, but later on, a long drawn out war began, which caused famine and cannibalism in the northern tribes in Israel. Now, a couple hundred years later, we find famine and cannibalism occurring in Judah. God finally gets fed up and he withdraws his protection. This is a perfect example. Mark, you were talking about, are they always there? Yeah, I think they're always there. But sometimes God takes them away. And that's what happened to, in Lamentations. When you read Lamentations, I mean, that book will tear at your heart. So anyway, now the complete biblical library says something to say about the rest of chapter 6 and 7. Siege in Samaria and its aftermath. A lengthy story now commands our attention, one which in its entirety spans some 30 verses in 2 chapters of the book. It's a long story. And many commentators on the book of Kings include chapter 7, the entire chapter, with the last 10 verses of chapter 6 as part of the same story. I agree with them. It certainly looks that way. So this story that we're about to get into is lengthy and somewhat complex, with 2 related parts. And I'm still reading what the commentary said. The first, verses 24 through 33, that we're about to look into, gives the extent of the siege-induced famine in the Israelite capital of Samaria, whereas the second, a carefully written account of the miraculous lifting of the famine within one day, which we will get to. Now, it could be, and I would put money on, well, I probably shouldn't bet, but anyway, it could be that this temporary lull was God's way of giving Israel a chance to repent, as he did Nineveh. But there was no repentance in Israel. Nope. Oh yeah, Yahweh, Elisha's God really helped us out. Now let's go worship Baal. The king of Israel continued with his wicked ways, and the people continued worship of pagan gods. Didn't change a thing. So God removed his protective hands. He removed this army, that Mark was talking about, the spiritual army with the chariots of fire and so on. And he allowed the Syrians to launch a full-scale invasion. Syria was able to reach the very gates of Samaria, the capital of Israel. And I looked at every source I could find to see what the length of the siege was, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I mean, anywhere. But obviously, based on what we're about to see, it was a long siege. And that's about all it said. So starting in verse 24, it said, it happened after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Syria. Now remember, there were 3 or 4 Ben-Hadad. So who knows which is Ben-Hadad 1, 2, 3, 4. But he gathered all his army and went and besieged Samaria. Now, the whole idea of siege, or blockades, if you will, is to drive the population to the extremities of hunger and thirst, to the extremes of hunger and thirst, so that they would capitulate without a fight. Just, we surrender, give us some food. Famine in this case is not an environmental condition. It's not because they didn't get any rain. It's not because they didn't plant their crops. It's not because whatever. The results of the siege was because they were surrounded by an enemy that did not let food go in or out of Samaria. The Holman Christian Study Bible says this: since neither the Israelites nor the Syrians were changed by the demonstrations of God's power. Because see, it could have changed Syria. When Syria saw what was going on, when the king found out that the God of Israel was giving information to Elisha, and he was giving information to the king of Israel, you would have thought it would have got his attention too. But no. So war eventually returned. Now, ideally, the circumstances of God's people should never have reached such a sorry state. Now, this is from that Holman Christian Study Bible. The biblical plan, or God's plan, if you will, was that a righteous king would defeat the enemies and save his people from such misery because they were surrounded by these chariots of fire. In this time of spiritual failure, which is what happened in Israel at this point, war had come with a devastating siege of Samaria and starvation among the people. The siege was so pressing that ceremonially unclean and detestable substances were being sold for exorbitant prices and eaten. And we'll get into some of that in a minute. This contrasted with the concept that the king was responsible to provide for his people's needs. I mean, isn't that a king's job? It's his main job. The king's failure came in a context in which God had provided past victories and vast victories and lessons that should have led to peace and prosperity. But they didn't, because they didn't listen. You know, at least Nineveh listened for a little while after, even though he didn't want to go, after Jonah warned them. They repented in sackcloth and ashes, but it didn't last forever. But at least they did it for a little while. Even Ahab for a little while. And God even made a comment about Abraham. He said to Elijah, he said, well, now look at this. Even Ahab will repent. Of course, it didn't last, but anyway. Okay, so the initial effects of this siege were of famine, starvation, and terribly inflated prices. Remember World War II, Germany. And people were taking wheelbarrows full of Dutch marks or whatever to pay 2 million Dutch marks for a loaf of bread or whatever. You know, inflation was so bad. Well, that's what's going on right now in Samaria. This blockade was so successful that the famine that swept through the city caused people to eat nauseating garbage. Now, if you have a weak stomach or you've just recently eaten, you may want to turn this off for a few minutes. This nauseating garbage was probably sold on the black market, and it was sold for exorbitant prices. Now, I'm not sure. As a matter of fact, I would doubt that very many people in the northern tribes cared much for the food laws. You know, they had separated themselves from the worship of the one true God. And you know, the scriptures don't tell us, but you can be relatively sure that they weren't keeping the food laws. Well, during a famine, they're not keeping the food laws a lot more. Did I say that? Did that make any sense? So they cared even less. They would eat anything. And we have some examples. Verse 25. There was great famine in Samaria, and indeed they besieged it. Okay, so they're surrounded by Syria for a long, long time, until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and dove droppings were sold for 5 shekels of silver. Now, I did some quick math as I was going through this, and this could be wrong. But to give you an idea of the inflation, that was taking place in Samaria. Common labor, in normal times, common labor was paid about a shekel per month. 1 shekel per month. Samaria besieged the northern tribes till a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver. 80 months of work. And the number that I came up with based on some, multiplications was about $6,000. A donkey's head, folks, very unclean. Maybe it had maggots. I don't know how long the head had been separated. And I also want to know what the heck happened to the rest of the donkey. Obviously, it was eaten. Doesn't say that here. Now, there are different opinions as to the use of these dove droppings. Some say that it was a type of salt, that you'd sprinkle it on your food. Sprinkle it. Honey, would you hand me the dove droppings, please? I need to salt up my chicken. Others say it was used for fuel. I hope it was used for fuel. Anyway, most of all, murder and cannibalism reduced the population to near insanity. Now, here we have another change.
Skip.
Yes.
Hey, Skip.
Yes.
So, yeah, I just looked up some weights and measures. So a shekel, according to the Bible Hub, a shekel is 0.4 ounces. So that much weight of silver. What was it? How many shekels? 80?
Yeah, so that'd be 20 ounces. Go ahead.
So, yeah, and then a cab is a dry measure, and it's about 1.1 quarts of volume. So that's how many, what was it, dove droppings or, yeah, dove droppings.
Yeah.
So that's about
just a watt.
cupful, a little over a cupful.
A quart?
Well, if it was a fourth of a cad of dove dropping, so it was a quarter of that. So it was about 1 1/4 cups of whatever of the droppings, and then it would have been a couple of pounds of silver, weight-wise.
Yeah, I wonder if a cup of dove droppings would enhance, our supper tonight. If we're making a stew. I'm sorry. This just.
Well, what's interesting is, as a student of history, what we're reading here of what happens during siege warfare is what always happens during siege warfare. You get cannibalism. I mean, there are stories of people literally ripping apart books in Stalingrad during the Nazi siege, eating the glue in the book bindings, or eating anything that was made of leather. Their shoes. They were boiling shoes and eating shoes. My wife's aunt was telling us that after the war in Italy, that she literally made soup that the family ate for 2 weeks out of a boiled boot, because that's all there was. No vegetables, just boot water that had been boiled, and that's what they lived on. And that's what happens, in as a consequence of war, especially siege warfare, where all supply routes are blocked off. So I mean, what we're reading here is almost a natural consequence of warfare. That's the only thought I had as we're talking about all this stuff's grossing you out, but
No.
It's standard when it comes to warfare. This is a standard feature of warfare, and especially siege warfare.
Yeah, and I don't know if I mentioned this. I may already have mentioned it, but I mentioned a little bit of it. But Lamentations you read what's happening, and that was the southern tribes. That was Judah, the one that continued to worship God, at least for a little while, longer than Israel did. But I mean, I can't imagine eating these things, and yet I'm not going to say I wouldn't, because I don't want to challenge God.
Well,
So
we had experience with that kind of starvation before, but I think that gives this gives a good context of why Jesus wept when he looked over Jerusalem and said, if you would have only listened, that I would have gathered you under my wings as a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you wouldn't listen. And he was weeping over what he knew was coming upon the city of Jerusalem, which is a lot of what we're reading in here. But, and that was in what, 80, 70, when the Romans sacked Jerusalem.
yeah,
A very similar situation, another aspect of siege warfare. It's horrifying. Even God's people, that when you're starving, that's a whole other animal. Your principles kind of get by the wayside when you're starving to death and your children are starving. Even these are God's people that were eating their own children in Jerusalem. So it does happen.
yeah. I've heard people say, I don't care how hungry I was, I would not eat a pig. You better watch saying that, Jack. You may have to.
Yeah. Yes, this tells me that silver was more plentiful than any food. They didn't have any.
That's a good point, Barb. That's a really good point. Money was worthless. And that's what inflation does. But people had plenty of money, but they didn't have any food. Well, it gets worse. So, as I said last week, gird up your loins, or as Stephen Curtis Chapman said, saddle up your horses, because it gets worse. Now, kings are often asked, and it's part of their job, to adjudicate court cases. And Solomon's case, dealing with the two women, one woman's baby got smothered, and the other woman's baby lived, and she tried to switch them out. And Solomon sat over that trial. You all remember that. But can you imagine being a king and being asked to adjudicate this situation? As the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, "Help, my lord, O king." And of course, the king wasn't in a very good mood. This is, the Israelite king, the northern tribes. He wasn't in a very good mood. He was hungry too. And he said, "If Yahweh's not going to help you, what can I do about it? From the threshing floor or from the wine press, you think I can go and get you some food or whatever?" Because he didn't know what she was about to ask. And the king said to her, "Well, what's wrong?" And this just blows me away. She answered, "Look, this woman and I made a deal. We'll cook and eat your son first, and we'll eat my son tomorrow." This is how hungry these people were. "And so we boiled my son and ate him." And so the next day, it's your son's turn to be lunch. And she said, "Give me your son that we may eat him." But she's hidden her son, king. So, this, other than just being pure sickening, this makes me curious. Was the woman upset that she had eaten her own son? Or just that the other woman hid hers so he couldn't be eaten? And I have to go with the second one. I think she was upset because she didn't have anything to eat. You know, we ate my son. Now it's your turn. Where's your son? Let's cook him. So let me say it again. A woman, out of desperation, ate her own son, and then was mad because her neighbor wouldn't cook her son. I mean, you know, we can spend a lot of time. Anybody got any comments? I don't know what you can say about this. Um, Anybody got any comments? I mean, it's not funny. It's just I don't know what you can say. This is just insane. But the people were starving to death, and they would eat anything.
I think it
Michael,
gives,
yeah,
I think it gives the words that Jesus said in context, where he said that in those days it'll be said that blessed are the mothers that never, never suckled children, infants in those days, and that ties into what you've just read. I think, even though it's a different time period, a siege and starvation and things like that, and warfare, those are horrifying things, and they're commonplace. And Jesus said that his own people, the women, would be, you're blessed if you never gave birth, is basically what was said. So I think this is the context for why such words were stated.
I never thought of that, Michael. I often wondered about that part of the scripture. I couldn't figure out what could be good about that, but I can see from this here that would be true.
yeah. I never had thought about that either, Michael. And I think that's a very good point. That may have very well been his meaning. You
Yeah,
know,
well, I mean, children, and we know that happened in Jerusalem when the Romans besieged it, that they would eat their own children. I mean, when Jesus was talking, and again, this is something that we Americans are woefully ignorant of, because we haven't had to experience warfare on that level. Even during the Civil War, you didn't have siege warfare that would actually starve out the inhabitants, where they had to turn to cannibalism to survive. But when you look at the whole history, and you look at how often siege warfare was used for this purpose, and what happens to the people that are caught inside, this is a horrifying thing that does happen. People negotiating and fighting over, we're eating your son tomorrow, we're eating mine, and this is something that happens quite often, as a matter of fact, in history. So it's not unusual. It's just that we don't have any experience with it in recent history that we would remember it. And I don't know if we're as many people are as up to date of what the lessons of history are, but this is what happens.
yep.
I'm wondering if that's 100% true, Mark, or accurate, that we have seen terrible periods in the Second World War, for example, the starving of Stalingrad in Russia, and the horror tales that came out of that. I think with human nature being the way it is, when things get tough, no matter what era it is, that people will degenerate to the lowest level in order to survive. Terrible that it is, and as the scriptures make point very clearly, but I think it happened in the Second World War as well.
Yes, yeah, you mentioned Stalingrad. It did. It happened quite frequently. Again, even after the war. Like I said, my wife's aunt made soup out of a boot. Anything that had leather in it, leather book bindings, leather saddles, boots, coats, belts. That was their source of food, because that's all there was. But there are instances of people eating other people to survive. It happens.
Yeah, the book or the movie Dr. Zhivago shows, maybe not to this degree, but it shows that it starts off with all the aristocrats and all of that, and then at the end, they're all starving and have absolutely nothing. So this has happened several times down through the years, And it happened particularly bad to the northern tribes and the southern tribes, and we may see, the same thing happen in the world again, and it hit this country this time. Okay, so as bad as this story was, I mean, can you imagine being the king and some lady said, "Hey, we ate my son yesterday, but Sally over there said we could eat hers today, and they've skipped the country. That's not fair. Go find him for me. I want to eat her son." Anyway, so as bad as this king was, whichever brother it was, this story shook him to his core. And guess who he blamed? Now, it happened when the king heard the words of the woman. He tore his clothes, and he was wearing sackcloth. So he was mourning. And then he said in verse 31, Elisha's a dead man. I'm going to take the head of Elisha, because this is all his fault. But here again, Elisha, God gave him the information of what the king of Syria was, I'm sorry, the king of Israel was saying. Elisha, he was sitting in his house, and the elders, I presume that's the sons of the prophets, or the elders of the prophets, anyway, were sitting with him, and the king sent a man ahead of him. Now, this is the king of Syria. The king, and Elisha knows about this. The king sent a man ahead of him, and his purpose, I think, was to go capture and cut off the head of Elisha. The king sent a man ahead of him, but before the messenger came to him, he said to the elders, this is Elisha, do you see how this son of a murderer has sent someone to take away my head? Now, the reason he called him the son of a murderer, whether it was King Ahaziah or King Joram, they were both sons of Ahab. So they were sons of a murderer. And verse 33 says, while they were talking with them, there was the messenger. Okay, the messenger got there. He was supposed to kill him. And then the king said, surely this calamity is from Yahweh. Why should I wait for Yahweh any longer? Now, this is a Paul type sentence. It's hard to really figure out what it is that is being said, because you've got two men having a conversation and they're not even together. One of the commentaries said, when the king did arrive and asked Elisha why he should wait. Why should he wait any longer for God to act? Well, why would he ask that? Well, it may have been that Elisha had told the king that God said, don't surrender to Ben-Hadad, but wait for divine deliverance. And since that didn't help fit, that help didn't fit the king's timetable, he decided to take matters into his own hand, like Saul. And you know what happened to Saul. So now these chapters run together. Chapter 7 is part of this same story. Then Elisha said, listen to the word of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh. Now, they've been in a siege for years. They're starving to death. They're eating donkey heads and dove dung and eating their own children. And here's what Yahweh says to Elisha to pass on to the king. Tomorrow, about this time, a measure of fine flour will be sold for a shekel. Notice the price has come down. and 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gate of Samaria. Okay, remember that, gate of Samaria. We're going to cover this next week, but food prices have dropped dramatic, or he says that they're going to drop dramatically. And, you know, the king and this royal officer of the king, who was quite sarcastic and probably a jerk, and he was better than Elisha and better than all those prophets, says the royal officer on whose hand the king was leaning answered Elisha and said, "Behold, if Yahweh should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? There is no way that your God is going to be able to pull this off and rid us of this famine so quickly." And then Elisha says, "Behold, you'll see it with your own eyes, but you're not going to eat of it." Now, Expositor's commentary has a good description of this discussion between Elisha and this servant of the king. Here's what they say. Elisha seized on the king's last glimmer of hope. By the next day, conditions would so improve that products would be available again, even though at a substantial price. They're still going to be expensive, but nothing like they are today. And the king's chief aide found such a statement preposterous. Even if Yahweh should open the windows of heaven and pour down a flood of flour and grain, if Yahweh opened up the sky and started dumping food, so dire had the famine been that even this would not suffice to make Elisha's prediction come true. And the aide's words were filled with ridicule and heaped with sarcasm, as if to say, "Oh, sure, Yahweh is even now making windows in heaven. So what? Could this word of yours still come to pass? You're crazy, Elisha." Whether the aide thought of the biblical phrase of the heaven windows of the Baal fertility cult is uncertain. Sorry, I messed that up. If maybe he knew of when fire came down from heaven and consumed the prophets of Baal. In any case, he was skeptical of the whole thing. But the prophet assured Joram's aide. Now I say Joram here because I copied this from the. It may not have been Joram, but it was one of the sons of Ahab. The prophet assured the king's aide that not only would the prophecy come true, but the officer would see it with his own eyes, but he wouldn't eat any of it. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that next time. His faithless incredulity, that's a big word, would cause him to miss God's blessing on the people. And I think this is a reasonable place to start because next week we're going to start back in verse 1 of chapter 7. But the siege will be over suddenly over. And we'll find out how in chapter 7. Now, some of you may already read it or remember when the last time you read it. And we'll find out why the aide wouldn't get to eat any of the Lord's bounty. So next time we'll begin chapter 7 again, and a very interesting story of 4 lepers who I'm not going to say they saved Israel, but they did find out some stuff, and they went back into Israel and said, "Hey guys, guess what?" So, but we'll cover that. We'll cover that next time. All right. Thoughts? That was a good discussion. Anything else anybody wants to add?
I was just thinking, going back to when they were under siege and what they were eating in order to stay alive. And yesterday I had watched a documentary film that is one of a couple of dozen that are up for consideration for the Anthem Film Festival that's held at Freedom Fest. And it's called Planet Lockdown. And you can access it on the internet and watch it. It's nearly 2 hours, but it's quite interesting. It's largely about how COVID has been used to destroy freedom, economics, medical science, all those aspects. But not done, you don't get it when you're watching it, you don't feel like some right-wing conspiratorialist. So it's worthy of listening. It's called Planet Lockdown. But in it, there's I think he's Swiss. And I'm not sure if he's a doctor or whatever, but he makes the point, because they're talking about the all the boosters and different things, and the level to which, if this is an attempt to, kind of control the world thing, there'll come a point where you won't be able to buy and sell and whatever without complying with their regulations. And he made the point that when you no longer fear death, then you're not driven to do things that would compromise your faith or your beliefs or whatever. And, so it made me think about the fact that, we need to be sufficiently confident in God's power and his plan to know that this physical life is not all there is to it, and sustaining this physical life by whatever means possible may not always be the best thing. I mean, think of the grief of those women who actually had allowed themselves to arrive at the point where they would kill their children and eat them in order to keep themselves alive. I mean, most of the time people would say, a mother would say, well, I'd throw myself in front of the car if it was to save my child, kind of thing. Now, the reality is, until you're in that situation, you really don't know what you do. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, if you truly believe God's plan is bigger and better than anything that we have now, then, then you have, when you reach that point, then clinging to what we have now becomes less important. And I, you kind of have the feeling that we may get to that point where we have to make that choice. And so just having that quiet confidence that there's much more beyond sustaining yourself physically. It's a hard place to arrive at, but at some point, we might be there.
What was that film, Jill?
The film was called Planet Lockdown. And if you put that in on Google, you'll get the website, and then it has, I think the link is Planet Lockdown Film or something, but it's an hour and 50 minutes. Quite interesting, and you've got that much time, it's well worth watching.
You make a great point, Jill, on the fact that we shouldn't be desirous to cling to our own lives so much. We have hope in the future of what Yeshua is bringing back with him. When he comes to establish the kingdom, we have that hope and that faith, and that should help us not try to have to cling to this life to the point where we're going to sacrifice our moral principles because the flesh is screaming at us that it wants to be sated. I would add to that as adults, we need to think about that in terms of looking at our own families, because usually that will be the fulcrum that the adversary will use to get us to compromise. Because this is the one thing that I learned in India, watching our brethren suffer. I didn't care if I was sick. I didn't care that I had dysentery. I didn't care that, you know, I had a high fever, or that if I was persecuted. I broke watching what was happening to the brethren. That's where I got angry at God and very upset with him, because I didn't see any relief, despite the prayers, despite their faithfulness. That was my breaking point. Wasn't that I was suffering. Yeah, I could go ahead and walk to death. It was knowing and watching those you love have to suffer, and being able to transcend just focusing on ourselves and what we're willing to do as far as laying down our lives, so that we don't have to cling to life by eating our children. We also have to look at our own families and our own children in that same light, because that's, again, I think that's a fulcrum that Satan will easily exploit in these difficult days that we may be entering ahead of us. Is that, yeah, we will sacrifice ourselves, but when it comes to our families, we'll compromise because we want them to survive. We want them to do well, and maybe that's something we need to be mindful of in advance, in case, so that if such things should visit us, that we don't compromise our moral compass, as it were. But thanks. Yeah, you make a great point.
Some of that, what you were saying about what was happening to Israel, kind of reminds me of North Korea. If you ever listen to a girl named Yamni Park, who escaped from North Korea, and of course they don't have Christianity over there, but she said all they think about is trying to get something to eat. They don't think about rising up against it or morality or all kinds of stuff like that. And all they care about is getting something to eat.
Yes, isn't the name of, I think the name of her book was, is it In Order to Live? Something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the name of it.
Yeah. And because she puts herself into sex trafficking in order that her family can live.
Well, she lived close to the border to China, and that night she saw the lights in China and thought, well, if they have lights at night, they must have food. And so her and her mom, I think there was I don't know a better way to put it, but there were people that were kind of like coyotes, you know, that get people here to the States, except they smuggle people into China. And to pay for it, the women go into prostitution. So both her mom and her had to go into prostitution to pay, you know, the person that smuggled her into China. And they were separated.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say because of China's one-child policy that ended up where they everybody kept the sons and they killed or aborted the daughters. They had a shortage of women in China, and her mother was sold to a farmer to be his wife and slave and childbearer and whatever in order to keep the family going. And so then Yeonmi went into the sex trade in order to make enough money. Well, she agreed with whoever her handler was that she would do it if he would rescue her mother from this relationship with the farmer that she'd been sold into. Is my understanding.
She originally, I guess ended up with a guy, and they were separated, and she told the guy, I don't know how long she was with the guy before she told this guy this, but she said, if you don't, you know, bring me and my mother together, I'm going to kill myself. And so the guy agreed to, I guess, buy her mother or bring her mother to where they could be together.
Yes, that's correct. And then he made money from the young woman from the sex trafficking. I think she ultimately was doing it online rather than in person. She realized that that was also, it made him enough money and she didn't actually have to participate. But yeah, the whole story is just makes you, you know, look at yourself and say, okay, what would I do in order to survive, you know? And then when she gets over to the US and she's at university and she's being taught by, you know, professors who basically are preaching communism and stuff that she had to escape from through terrible means. She just felt so compromised by it all. She, you know, she was not what she expected. But there's lots of stuff about her online. But her book, I watched an interview she did with Jordan Peterson, and then I read through some of the stuff on the book as well.
Yeah, the thing that I just, you wouldn't even think about is when she first she went to I think Mongolia. She from China. Her and her mother, or maybe her mother came. She got her mother later. I forget. But she went to Mongolia, and then she went from there to South Korea. And when they got her to South Korea, they didn't just let her go out into the population. They actually had to teach her how to be free, and because she didn't know how to make decisions. And I thought that was pretty interesting, that you know,
Right.
having to actually teach somebody how to make decisions so you could live in a free society.
Well, you have to remember that she was like 10, 11, 12 when she was going through the sex trafficking thing in China and Mongolia. And she was still a young teen when she arrived in South Korea, I believe. So, you know, when you think that those are the formative years of your life, she had no other experience that would teach her